Just drive straight and don't try anything heroic, the terrorist said as he boarded her bus during the chaos. 20 minutes later, as Rachel maneuvered through burning wreckage with tactical precision, he realized his mistake. "Lady, where did you learn to drive like this?" "Helmand Province," she replied calmly. "And the name's Staff Sergeant Thompson. Welcome to Hidden Legends." Before we begin this powerful story of courage, skill, and forgotten heroism, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. At 5:30 a.m. every weekday morning, Rachel Thompson started her shift as driver of Metro Bus Route 47 in downtown Denver, Colorado. The same route she had driven for 8 years, from the suburban neighborhoods through the business district, past the federal building, and ending at Union Station. Rachel was 45 years old, with graying brown hair always pulled back in a neat bun, and hands that gripped the steering wheel with the confidence of someone who had driven much more dangerous roads than these city streets. Her passengers knew her as the friendly driver who always waited an extra few seconds if she saw someone running for the bus, who kept tissues behind her seat for crying commuters, and who somehow always stayed calm in Denver's notorious traffic jams. What they didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson had spent 12 years in the United States Army, the last 6 as the lead driver for armored convoys in Afghanistan and Iraq. She had navigated through IED-riddled highways, survived 3 roadside bomb attacks, and had been decorated twice for keeping her convoy alive under enemy fire. She had left the military when her daughter Emma started having panic attacks every time Rachel deployed. "I can't keep wondering if you're coming home, Mom," Emma had said during their last video call from Kabul. That conversation had lasted only 5 minutes, but it changed everything. So Rachel Thompson traded her armored Humvee for a city bus, her military radio for a dispatch system, and her Kevlar helmet for a simple driver's cap with the Metro Transit logo. She found peace in the routine, the same stops, the same passengers, the predictable rhythm of city life. But some skills never fade. Rachel still automatically checked her mirrors every few seconds, still identified potential exit routes at every intersection, and still unconsciously evaluated every person who boarded her bus. Old habits from roads where a moment's inattention could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a flag-draped box. This Tuesday morning seemed no different from the hundreds that had come before. Rachel performed her pre-shift inspection, checked her route schedule, and pulled out of the depot at exactly 6:15 a.m. for her first run of the day. At 3:47 p.m., during the height of rush hour traffic, everything changed. The first explosion came from the direction of the federal building, a distant thunderclap that made windows rattle throughout downtown Denver. Rachel was stopped at the intersection of 16th and Blake when the shockwave rolled over them, and she immediately recognized the sound that most civilians hoped they would never hear, the deep, bone-shaking boom of a car bomb. Her 43 passengers looked around in confusion, some pulling out their phones to check the news, others craning their necks to see what had happened. But Rachel's training kicked in instantly. She had heard that sound too many times in Fallujah and Kandahar to mistake it for anything else. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and stay calm," she announced over the bus intercom, her voice steady and authoritative. "We're going to take a different route today." The second explosion, closer this time, shattered windows in the building beside them and sent pedestrians running in all directions. Car alarms began wailing throughout the downtown area, and Rachel could see smoke rising from multiple locations across the city skyline. This wasn't an accident, this was coordinated. Rachel locked the bus doors with a quick motion, checking her mirrors to assess the situation around them. Traffic was starting to snarl as panicked drivers abandoned their cars or tried to flee in every direction at once. But Rachel had seen this before: the chaos, the panic, the way terror could paralyze people who had never faced it. Her passengers were starting to panic now. A businessman in the third row was shouting into his phone about being trapped downtown. An elderly woman near the front was crying quietly. A young mother held her toddler closer, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. "Ma'am, shouldn't we get off the bus?" called out a college student near the back. "We need to get away from downtown." Rachel met his eyes in her rearview mirror. "Right now, this bus is the safest place you can be. Trust me." She had driven through 3 separate ambushes in Anbar province. She had navigated burning cities and hostile checkpoints. She knew how to read terrain, how to identify threats, and most importantly, how to keep moving when staying still meant death. The third explosion, less than 2 blocks away, made the decision for everyone. Rachel shifted into gear and began moving through the gridlocked traffic with a precision that surprised even her passengers. Rachel drove like no city bus driver her passengers had ever seen. She used emergency lanes, service roads, and routes that didn't exist on any metro transit map. She navigated around abandoned vehicles with millimeter precision, reading the urban terrain like a tactical manual. "How does she know where she's going?" whispered the elderly woman to the businessman beside her. But Rachel was operating on a different level now. Years of convoy experience had taught her to think 3 moves ahead, to identify safe routes through hostile territory, and to keep her vehicle moving no matter what obstacles appeared in front of them. The fourth explosion, directly ahead of their intended route, sent a fireball into the sky and rained debris across the intersection. Other vehicles were trapped, their drivers paralyzed by the scope of what was happening. But Rachel calmly shifted into reverse, backed up 50 yards with the skill of someone maneuvering a 40-foot vehicle in tight spaces, and took an alternate route that avoided the blast zone entirely. "Jesus Christ, lady," muttered the businessman, "where did you learn to drive like that?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She was focused on the road ahead, where she could see armed figures moving between the buildings. This wasn't just random terrorism, this was organized, tactical, and designed to trap people exactly where her bus would have been if she had followed the normal route. That's when she saw him, a man in tactical gear flagging down vehicles at the next intersection, forcing drivers out at gunpoint. He had positioned himself at the only exit from the downtown area that most people would know about. But Rachel knew about Service Road 7, a maintenance route behind the water treatment plant that connected to the highway. It wasn't on any public maps, but convoy drivers learned about routes like that, the hidden paths that could save your life when the obvious roads became kill zones. As they approached the intersection where the gunman waited, Rachel made a decision that would have been impossible for any civilian driver. She accelerated directly toward the armed man, using the bus's size and weight as tactical advantages, forcing him to dive for cover as 43 passengers and their driver escaped through a gap that existed only in the mind of someone who had done this before. "Holy shit," breathed the college student. "Did she just do that on purpose?" That's when the gunman appeared at Rachel's driver's side window. The armed man had recovered faster than Rachel expected. As she slowed for the next intersection, he appeared alongside the bus, his weapon raised, signaling her to stop. Rachel had no choice but to comply. With passengers aboard, she couldn't risk a firefight. She opened the front door, and he climbed aboard quickly, his rifle trained on the terrified passengers. He was young, probably mid-20s, with the nervous energy of someone operating on adrenaline and ideology rather than training. "Just drive straight and don't try anything heroic," he commanded, settling into the seat directly behind Rachel, where he could watch both her and the passengers. "Take us to the highway, and nobody gets hurt." Rachel nodded calmly, putting the bus in gear. "Where on the highway?" "You'll know when we get there," he replied. "Just drive." But as Rachel began moving through the chaos of downtown Denver, something remarkable happened. Her years of convoy experience took over completely. She began using techniques that no civilian driver would know, reading the terrain for ambush points, identifying escape routes, using the vehicle's weight and momentum as tactical tools. She took them through a route that avoided the main attack zones while appearing to comply with his directions. She used the bus's mirrors to keep track of his position and weapon orientation. Most importantly, she began maneuvering toward areas where she knew law enforcement response would be strongest. "Lady, where did you learn to drive like this?" the gunman asked after Rachel executed a perfect tactical turn that avoided a burning vehicle while maintaining speed and control. Rachel met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Helmand Province," she replied calmly. "And the name Staff Sergeant Thompson." The recognition hit his face like a physical blow. The calm, professional way she had been driving suddenly made sense. The tactical precision, the knowledge of urban combat zones, the complete lack of panic under fire. This wasn't a civilian bus driver, this was a soldier. "You're military," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. 12 years Army, Rachel confirmed, still driving with the same steady competence. 6 of those driving convoys through territory a lot more dangerous than downtown Denver. The gunman looked around at the 43 passengers who were now listening to every word, their faces showing a mixture of fear and dawning hope. He had boarded what he thought was a helpless civilian target and found himself trapped with someone who knew more about urban warfare than he did. "That doesn't change anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Rachel smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had faced down more dangerous enemies than a nervous young man with more ideology than training. "Actually, it changes everything." Rachel continued driving, but now her passengers could see that every movement was deliberate, calculated, professional. She wasn't just avoiding danger, she was actively outmaneuvering it. The gunman was beginning to realize that he had made a critical error. Instead of commandeering a helpless city bus, he had trapped himself inside a vehicle operated by someone with 12 years of combat experience and an intimate knowledge of exactly how to handle situations like this. "Ma'am," called out the elderly woman from the front seat, her voice shaky but determined, "are we going to be okay?" Rachel met her eyes in the mirror. "Yes, ma'am. Everyone who got on my bus this morning is going home tonight. I promise you that." It was the same promise she had made to her convoy crews in Afghanistan, simple, direct, and backed by skills that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. The gunman shifted nervously in his seat. "Just keep driving. Don't try anything stupid." But Rachel was already 3 moves ahead. She had identified his weapon type, calculated his field of fire, and noted that his position behind her gave him control over the passengers, but limited his ability to actually threaten her while she was driving. Most importantly, she was taking them toward a location where this could end safely. "You know," Rachel said conversationally, "in convoy operations we had a saying, the mission is simple, everyone goes home. Doesn't matter if we're talking about soldiers in Helmand or passengers on a city bus. Same mission. Shut up and drive," the gunman snapped, but some of the passengers were starting to sit up straighter, sensing that their quiet bus driver was far more than she appeared. Rachel made a series of tactical turns that brought them into an industrial area where she knew police response would be coordinated and controlled. She had been listening to the emergency radio chatter on her bus radio, and she knew that law enforcement was establishing a perimeter exactly where her route was taking them. "How do you know all these back roads?" the businessman asked quietly. "When you drive convoys for a living, you learn that the obvious route is usually the most dangerous one," Rachel replied. "You always have a primary route, an alternate route, and an emergency route. Right now, we're on route number 3. The gunman was looking around nervously now, realizing that the urban landscape outside the windows looked nothing like what he had expected. This wasn't the main highway where his associates were probably waiting. This was somewhere else entirely. "Where are we?" he demanded. Rachel checked her mirrors one final time, then made her last tactical decision of the day. She had brought them to a location where law enforcement had clear sightlines, where her passengers would be safe, and where a nervous young terrorist would face professional operators instead of helpless civilians. "We're at the end of the line," she said simply, bringing the bus to a stop in a position that gave her passengers maximum protection while exposing the gunman to crossfire from multiple directions. "Everyone stay down," she announced calmly. "This will be over in just a minute." The tactical response was swift and professional. Within 30 seconds of Rachel's bus stopping, law enforcement operators had surrounded the vehicle with precision that spoke of extensive training and coordination. They knew exactly where to position themselves because someone had been feeding them tactical information throughout the crisis. The gunman looked around in growing panic as he realized that his hostage situation had somehow turned into his capture. "How did they know where to find us?" Rachel smiled slightly. "Because I've been talking to them on the radio for the last 20 minutes. Every turn we made, every route change, they knew exactly where we were going." It was true. Rachel had been using her bus radio to coordinate with emergency responders, providing them with real-time intelligence about the threat level, the gunman's position, and the safest way to resolve the situation. Skills learned in convoy operations, where communication and coordination meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice from outside the bus, amplified by a megaphone. "This is Denver PD. We need everyone to remain calm and follow the bus driver's instructions exactly. The passengers looked at Rachel with new understanding. Their quiet, friendly bus driver had been in command of the situation from the moment the first explosion went off. She had kept them safe, outmaneuvered the terrorist, and delivered them to safety using skills they never knew she possessed. The resolution was textbook perfect. The gunman, surrounded and outmaneuvered, surrendered without firing a shot. The passengers were evacuated safely and systematically, and Rachel Thompson, who had promised that everyone would go home that night, kept her word. As the passengers filed off the bus, many of them stopped to thank her personally. The elderly woman from the front seat took her hand and said simply, "Thank you for bringing us home." The businessman, who had been shouting into his phone hours earlier, approached with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you. You saved all our lives." Rachel shook his hand firmly. "Just doing my job, sir." But Detective Mike Harrison of Denver PD, who had coordinated the response, knew better. He approached Rachel as she finished her post-incident report. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," he said, using her military rank, "that was some of the finest tactical driving and crisis management I've ever seen." "How long were you military?" 12 years, Detective. 3 deployments, mostly convoy operations." Detective Harrison nodded. "We could use someone with your skills and experience. Have you ever considered law enforcement?" Rachel looked out at the city skyline, where the smoke was finally clearing, and normal life was beginning to resume. Then she thought about Emma, her daughter, who would be getting home from school soon, and expecting her mother to be there for dinner. "I appreciate the offer, Detective, but I have the job I want. These streets, these passengers, they're my convoy now, and I'm going to make sure everyone gets home safe, one route at a time." Detective Harrison smiled and shook her hand. "The city's lucky to have you, ma'am." 3 hours later, Rachel Thompson was sitting at her kitchen table, helping Emma with her algebra homework, when the news came on television. The anchor was reporting on the terrorist attack that had been thwarted by the quick thinking of law enforcement and an unnamed city bus driver who had helped coordinate the response. Emma looked up from her math book. "Mom, were you driving during all that chaos downtown today?" Rachel smiled and helped her daughter with the next equation. "Just another day at work, honey. Just another day keeping everyone safe. Because that's what soldiers do. They serve where they're needed most, whether that's on the roads of Afghanistan or the streets of Denver. They adapt their mission to their circumstances, but they never forget their core purpose. Everyone goes home." Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in distant wars. Sometimes they're fought on city bus routes by drivers who know that protecting people is more important than glory, recognition, or thanks. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who choose to serve quietly, competently, and without fanfare. Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson had found her place in the world, not behind the wheel of an armored Humvee, but behind the wheel of Metro Bus Route 47, making sure that her passengers, her convoy, her community stayed safe. And every morning at 5:30 a.m., she would be there ready for whatever the road ahead might bring. Thank you for joining us at Hidden Legends. If Rachel's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that everyday heroes walk among us, often invisible until the moment they step forward to protect what matters most. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and who are the unsung heroes in your community? Until next time, remember, legends aren't always the loudest people in the room. Sometimes they're quietly driving the bus, keeping watch and making sure everyone gets home safe at the end of the day. Keep your eyes open. The next legend you meet might be taking your ticket, driving your route, or simply doing the work that keeps your world running safely, one day at a time.